Welcome to the third conference dedicated to the winners of the 2024 Ludwig Prize. Today I'm very happy. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Holly Lawson, correct?
Yes.
Directly from York, UK. Holly was awarded for the third prize of the Ludwig Prize for her beautiful, great article titled Between Revival and Reaction, Tragedy in Thought and Practice. So, Holly, thank you for joining us today. And let me introduce you. Holly is an incoming PhD student at Jesus College, the University of Cambridge. The research of Holly focuses on the classical reception of in 19th century music, including opera, incidental music for plays, and salon music. In today's talk, we will be, maybe Holly will discuss about not only music, but also theater, correct, Holly? Not only music, but even theater, and particularly even we will talk about ancient Greek theater. So speaking about theater, Holly, the stage is yours. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Holly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and anyone else who's watching me remotely. It's an absolute honor to have been awarded third place in the Ludwig Prize.
We are honored.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I'm very excited to see kind of what's next for the society. I know you've just been telling me about being in Bayreuth, and I'm very honored to be a tiny part of La Voce and all the amazing work you're doing with Andrea. The paper I'll be presenting today is an ongoing project. It's really an offshoot of my MPhil thesis. And I certainly don't identify as a Wagner scholar, though hopefully one day I might if I'm lucky. So I'd be very grateful if anyone has any comments or questions or feedback from me. My paper will also be a little bit different to the other two prize winners in that I really want to address a historiographical issue in terms of bringing to light a forgotten aspect of Wagner's love for the Greeks. So there's quite a few primary sources, so please bear with me. My approach has been very source-based and less application to say things like modern staging, as was brought up in the other talks. But I'll definitely try and keep to the time limit, so we might have a quick chat at the end. Okay. I want to take us back to the year 1841. We're in the home of Johann Paul von Walkenstein on a cold, late November evening in Leipzig. Felix Mendelssohn is sat at the piano accompanying a 35-year-old actress, none other than Louise Brockhaus, Wagner's older sister. Amid Mendelssohn's harmonies, Brockhaus declaims in recitative, Hymen's hymn never there will sound, there no bridal chorus ever will greet me. I'm betrothed to Acheron. Now, any keen readers of the Theban plays may recognize that these are the words of Antigone, the eponymous Theban princess of Sophocles' play first performed around 441 BC. In the passage I've just read, we hear the voice of Antigone bemoaning her impending doom, set at the hands of her own uncle Creon, who was ordered her execution for wanting to bury her deceased brother, Polynices, whom Creon considers a political traitor. The text is an extract from Johann Donner's translation used for Mendelssohn's incidental work to Sophocles' tragedy, Antigone. Having been commissioned by King Friedrich Wilhelm IV in the previous summer, it premiered in the Neues Palais Court Theatre in Potsdam on the 28th of October 1841 and enjoyed a public performance in Leipzig the following March. Building on Sophocles' original structure, Mendelssohn's work comprised of an overture and 7 choral odes for male choir, interspersed with episodes set in recitative to be spoken by the principal characters of the play. The extract I read is from the Komos, a song sung between the chorus and a dramatic character in ancient Greek theatre. And just to note, I will refer to Mendelssohn's production as Antigone in my presentation. So unless I otherwise indicate, I'm not referring to Sophocles' original play, but Mendelssohn's incidental music for it. The production inaugurated the revivification of what I'm calling musicalized stage Greek tragedy in 1840s Prussia, signalling Friedrich's Prussian court as a locus for the educated elite in Berlin, since he employed for the production some of the most prominent stage practitioners, literary scholars, classicists, and musicians of the time. And some of these figures I'm going to be introducing to you very, very shortly. Indeed, in a sentiment which can perhaps most aptly be described as pre-Wagnerian, in an 1842 handbook to the production, the art historian Ernst Tolkien speaks of the Greek theatre in all its parts being poetry, music, dance, and architecture, the most harmonious, the most complete artwork. Thus, the meticulous attendance to an array of artistic art forms exceeded enacting scholarly accuracy. It became a mode through which the Prussian court exercised cultural authority by tapping into an artistic heritage Germans believed they inherited from the Greeks and induced a quasi-cathartic experience for spectators. It should be remembered that the king enabled one of the first productions of Greek tragedy to be staged with music for the choruses alone since Andrea Gabrieli's Oedipus Rex in 1585. As well as this temporal significance, the work covered a vast geographical distance as well, travelling to New York, Athens, Dublin, and even Melbourne, Australia by the 1880s, though all roads led back to the Potsdam court. To commemorate the event, Friedrich commissioned this bronze medallion. On the left, we see Sophocles' profile surrounded by what was thought to be his epitaph. So, quote, "Gaze upon the eternal Sophocles who won first prize in the art of tragedy, the most revered of art forms." On the flip side, we see Antigone surrounded by the profiles of Mendelssohn, the composer, on the left, Ludwig Tieck, the stage designer, on the right, and Medusa at the very top of the coin. The inscription below Antigone is the Greek form of the premiere's date, so the 28th of October, 1841. Thus, by unifying figures thought to harness high civic status under the Sophoclean emblem, the king parades his enabling of this artistic union. While an oft-neglected work, even within the realm of Mendelssohnian scholarship, what is also overlooked is Wagner's own reception of Antigone, as he lays out in several of his essays, including Opere und Drama and Mementos de Spontini, both of 1851, on operatic poetry and composition of 1879, and even in a letter to Nietzsche in 1872. My main aim today is to unpick Wagner's polemic against Antigone in the hope of reassessing the way we frame his relationship.
Sorry. There is a black screen and with the...
Yeah, it's meant to be black, sorry.
Okay. Sorry, go on. Okay.
No worries. More specifically, I want to tease out what we really mean by words like revival or rebirth, as we so often see in Wagner scholarship. Any Wagner scholar worth his or her salt is aware that Wagner's fascination with the Greeks played an informative role throughout his creative life. As classical philologist Wolfgang Schadewald points out in his Bayreuth lectures of the 1960s on Wagner and the Greeks, we can rationalize this timeline into three distinct periods. However, Antigone doesn't quite fit this model, and I find it quite amusing that Antigone's performance run in Europe coincidentally fills a gap within Schadewald's timeline after 1842. So I suggest that we can fill this gap with Antigone, though, as I will show you today, the so-called Antigone period preoccupied Wagner way into the 1870s, so essentially for the rest of his life. My argument will stress that the words revival and rebirth are somewhat redundant, or at least partially overlook how tragedy, or to be more precise, staged tragic action, saturated the composer's evolving doctrine of drama. I want to suggest that as well as a rebirth or a revival, we can also think of Wagner's ideas of classical drama as emanating from him reacting to tragedy in the theatre, Mendelssohn's Antigone being the prime example of this. Yes, in the 19th century, scholars and lovers of the ancient world read, translated, and studied the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But my paper today casts engagement with Greek tragedy during the 1840s in a very different light. Tragedy through musical productions like Mendelssohn's could now be seen, and probably more importantly, heard in the drastic sense, to borrow musicologist Carolina Barte's term. I certainly don't deny or devalue Wagner's more scholarly philological enterprises, particularly his readings of Aeschylus and translations of Homer during his youth, as I think it was these very same academic engagements with tragedy and ancient literature that came to colour his later impression of Antigone. Ultimately, I aim to stress how the culture of stage tragedy at this time may have had a larger role in the conception of Wagner's philosophical tenets than have been previously assumed, particularly those concerning the power of myth, historical trajectory, stagecraft, and vocal utterance. There are two particular aspects of Antigone that I will use to explicate my wider discussion on Wagnerian drama. These are staging and dramatic declamation. As is perhaps inevitable when studying the Mendelssohn-Wagner relation, Wagner's ideologies of race and art naturally arise. I have chosen not to dwell too much on his ill-founded, problematic, and, to be frank, vulgar political views towards the composer of Antigone. Whilst it is somewhat impossible to completely divorce his ideologies from his discussions of Mendelssohn, I also believe there were legitimate theatrical reasons behind Wagner's dismissal of Antigone. And I hope today to show you what these were. Antigone travelled the globe. It is for this reason that it makes it difficult to discern which specific performances Wagner attended, considering that Antigone was staged in Paris and Dresden in the early 1840s, where Wagner, of course, moved between during this time. Saying that, based upon what he describes in his later essays, it's most likely that Wagner saw one or more of the 8 Dresden performances in 1844 at the newly built Court Theatre, where he was, of course, Kapellmeister from 1843 to 49, and also where Rienzi, the Flying Dutchman, and Tannhäuser all enjoyed their premieres. In his essay Mementos to Spontini, Wagner describes attending a party at the home of Wilhelmine Schroeder-Devrient, where Italian composer Spontini and writer Heinrich Heine were also present. The soprano supposedly made Spontini and Heine attend a performance of Antigone that was happening across the street, so most likely at this court theatre. Upon seeing it was the Berlin Sing Academy perform as the chorus, however, Spontini supposedly turned to his companion and said that he wished to leave. Wagner also claims that Spontini told everyone at the gathering that his own opera, Olympie, of 1819, is more in keeping with classical style than Mendelssohn's. This account speaks to wider criticism the choruses of Antigone garnered outside of Germany, though perhaps also Wagner's proclivity towards hyperbole in his prose essays. Unfortunately, I don't have time for this today, but if anyone is interested, I would really recommend the work by Fiona McIntosh and Edith Hall and their book, Greek Tragedy and the British Theatre. Our most detailed insight into Wagner's reception of the production, however, is documented in Oper und Drama, a passage which has received very little scholarly attention. He writes that King Friedrich, quote, commanded his stage intendant to produce before him with antiquarian fidelity a real Greek tragedy, for which a famous composer had to prepare the needful music. In face of our present-day life, this Sophoclean drama showed itself as a clumsy artistic fib, as a quibble patched up by artistic penury to cloak the untruthfulness of our whole art doings, as a prevarication which tried to lie away the true want of our times under all manner of artistic pretexts. Yet one plain truth this tragedy could not help bearing, namely that we have no drama and can have no drama. Just to be doubly sure that Wagner is referring to Mendelssohn's Antigone here, William Ashton Ellis, the prominent 19th century translator of Wagner's prose, provides these footnotes. If Wagner's omission of Mendelssohn's name was not enough to signal his disdain for the production, Wagner's sentiment and resorting to language such as fidelity, untruthfulness, and white lie, or Notlüge in the original German, underpin his inherent belief in the incompatibility of Greek drama in its ancient form in modern day. By foregrounding ideas of authenticity, Wagner had identified what was both the reason for the production's initial success and its eventual demise from Mendelssohn's canon, and this was its purporting to authentically classical stage practice, but this is something I'll be returning to in a moment. I also think it's relevant that part of Wagner's dislike for the production stemmed from its beginnings as a royal commission. He was evidently aware of the production's genesis as a courtly production, as he states in Opera und Drama. He writes, quote, "How rejoice were the learned old children at this Antigone in the court theatre of Potsdam," unquote. Conceiving of the Potsdam and, to a partial extent then, the Dresden court theatres as both physical spaces and metonyms for their own spectatorships, Antigone signified the bourgeoisie theatre culture from which Bayreuth would later provide an oasis. As he writes in Art and Revolution, within the ample boundaries of the Grecian amphitheatre, the whole populace was wont to witness the performances. In our superior theatres, lol, only the affluent classes. Well, for Wagner, Antigone did just that. It was an apt example of the degradation of modern art, amounting to little more than mere entertainment for the upper classes, all within a physical space of the court theatre, that celebrated, represented, and magnified societal status, but also relied upon the monetary capital of the rich, an institutional setup Wagner was eager to escape from by appealing to das Volk. As he writes in Artwork of the Future, our modern stage buildings are laid out in accord with traditional laws and canons which have nothing in common with the requirements of pure art. Where speculation for gain on the one side joins forces with luxurious ostentation on the other, the absolute interests of art must be cryingly affected. The parceling of our public into the most diverse categories of class and civil station, which he goes on to decry. How could a real artwork arise from this physical compartmentalizing of social type, which represented the disintegration of the community? Well, for Wagner, it simply couldn't. This pencil sketch by the production stage designer Ludwig Tieck, completed the year of the court premiere, gives us a few more clues as to how the Potsdam court is an example of what Wagner is speaking of here. If we read Tieck's annotation at the bottom of the sketch, he clearly designates, quote, "the seats for the king and the court." This drawing thus denotes an inherent hierarchy amongst the arrangement of the spectators by cordoning off the royal family from everybody else, exemplifying what Wagner refers to as parceling off spectators purely based upon class. It also indicates the type of historical arena Tieck was attempting to emulate. As shown by the green arrow, this screen was used to hide the orchestra and conductor from the view of the audience, including those in the royal box. Though in a bitter irony, I find it quite amusing that in a famous anecdote about the premiere of Die Meistersinger, Wagner was actually seen seated in the royal box with Ludwig and bowed to the audience from it. Though it should also be remembered that the king did sponsor the premiere. So just going back to this sketch, if I can make this analogy, where this configuration may have some affinity with Bayreuth's design is this very attempt to disguise the musicians in the pit. As classicist August Burch writes in his Handbook to Antigone, which he put together whilst he was acting as a scholarly advisor to the production, the accompanying instruments as well as the conductor were concealed as much as possible. Despite this attempt to conceal the source of the modern sound world to induce more of an immersive experience, what was being offered on stage as visual spectacle evidently did little to impress a now 30-year-old Wagner. But why did Burch and Tieck try and conceal the musicians to begin with? And why was Wagner speaking about authenticity and fidelity in Opera und Drama? Antigone heralded a new approach to staging Greek tragedy by cultivating what we might call an, quote, aura of authenticity, unquote. Tieck, Burch, and Mendelssohn attempted to emulate ancient Greek theatrical culture by using Johann Donner's recent metrical German translation of the original Greek, historically informed costumes, as well as drawing up a very unique set design. And I'd like to highlight a few details with regards to the stage to illustrate my point about its claims to historical practice. So this watercolour sketch was completed by Johann Carl Jacob Gerst in 1842. He was also Mendelssohn's collaborator for A Midsummer Night's Dream. It depicts the staging designed by poet Ludwig Tieck, whose literary work Phantasus is often credited to be the inspiration for Tannhäuser. For example, the protagonist's allusions to natural beauty of the Venusberg in the second scene, as well as him returning in the final act wearing torn rags and looking particularly pale and haggard, supposedly comes from Tieck's Phantasus. Just going back to this sketch then, Gerst was kind enough to provide us with multiple perspectives of the stage, from the front, the sides, and also from above, highlighting the intricacy and somewhat mathematical nature of the stage design. The inspiration for this came from Ginelli's 1818 architectural study into the Dionysian theatre in Athens. As is hopefully evident from his highly detailed key and concentric quadrilateral configurations, the attention to mathematical proportion and symmetrical layout is quite remarkable. It's also interesting that to note that in his PhD thesis on Wagnerian visual spectacle, Nicholas George Rogers claims that Wagner was actually aware of this very drawing. I haven't found any evidence to this, but it's interesting to speculate upon nonetheless. Though we can assume that adjustments were made to account for the size of the court theatre, since Book describes how they used very, very steep staircases, this approach instantiated the wider predilection for philological study going on in Germany at this time. This can be seen by figures such as Gottfried Samper, whose plans for an opera house in Munich were adopted by Wagner for Bayreuth, particularly the double proscenium shown here by the two green arrows. So the suffusion of this architectural classicism is also evidenced by Karl Schinkel's Neue Wache and Altes Museum, which remain neoclassical landmarks in Berlin's urban landscape to this day. Though little survives from the fire in 1869, Semper actually designed the sets for the Dresden performances that Wagner and his circle attended. Wagner claims in Mementos to Spontini that Schroeder Devrient insisted Spontini and Heine should attend a performance of Antigone as it, quote, assuredly would interest him on account of the antique arrangement of the stage after Semper's excellent plans. Unfortunately, I have yet to find any surviving sketches of Semper's design for the Dresden Theatre, though it's clear that Wagner was very much aware of the production's historicist ethos and even seems to praise it in this passage. Given Wagner's long friendship with Semper, however, I think we can read into this anecdote as a slight to Mendelssohn, as he doesn't even mention the music, and somewhat masking his true feelings towards the production, being a clumsy artistic fib, as he stated in Opera und Drama. Though this wasn't all done mainly for visual effect, the stage layout offered a novel experience for spectators and actors needing to adjust to the intricacies of ancient stagecraft. This can be seen by the various entrance and exit passageways within the wings, main stage area, as well as by the 3 different doors within the facade of the Palace of Thebes. In the Attic Theatre of Athens, the parados on each side of the stage were used by the actors and chorus for their entrances and exits. This had a dramatic effect, but also offered dramaturgical clarity, given the Greek theatre only used a handful of actors. Gerst provides us with this detail in his annotation shown here on my slide in the green circle, noting that these staircases were to be used for the entrance of the chorus alone. The use of a curtain was also used to unveil characters in a dramatic manner. Mendelssohn himself tells us so in a letter to George McFarren, who was preparing to conduct the London premiere. While it's tricky to identify what emblem is on the curtain, whether it was a royal crest or some other symbol of mythological origin, I think the use of colour here is worth noting. I've already mentioned that Gottfried Semper oversaw the designs for the Dresden performances Wagner was familiar with, though he's more broadly known as a figure who championed polychromy in his theories of classical architecture, advocating for the use of colour for different symbolic and aesthetic ends. Though I'm speculating at this point, I wonder whether Semper took up Gerst's baton in using very colourful scenery for the performances in Dresden. So, while Gerst and Ginelli's illustrations captured their awareness of an ancient style of what we might call blocking today, modern technologies and adaptations to scenery, like the staircases, the curtain, and even electrical lighting later in the century, betray their generalised approach to historically informed scenery. The dictums and aesthetics of historically informed performance is, of course, an ongoing discussion in musicology today. While I don't have time to open up that can of worms, its presuppositions evidently apply in this case. I also want to quickly highlight the thymele shown here in the pink circles. Since Attic tragedy was historically performed in praise of the god Dionysus, this altar designated the theatrical arrangement as a sacred space and was used for the chorus to sing and dance around. In some ways, we can read this simile as standing for everything Wagner venerated about antiquitous theatre, since performances occurred at religious festivals, and it was this collective, communal nature of Greek drama that Wagner admired and wanted to supplant in his own operatic enterprise. The simile was arranged in a space called the orchestra, which is where we get our modern term from. Providing visual distinction between the actors on the elevated platform shown here in the blue square and on the chorus on the lower level in the green, we see how the simile's arrangement served aesthetic and practical purposes simultaneously. The final feature I'd like to very quickly highlight is the altar to Apollo, shown here in the slide on in the purple circle. I've already mentioned how in 5th century Athens, performances of tragedy were given in honour of Dionysus, not explicitly Apollo, who was the god of the sun, archery, and most importantly for our purposes, music. It's therefore somewhat surprising that there's a designated altar to the deity on stage, but for me, this is Tieck's way of signalling a more generalised affinity with the musical culture of ancient Greece, rather than paying homage to any specific histrionic function. Thus, for the most part, while these props acted as agents to legitimise their historical method, the practitioners also took liberties to embrace an unabashedly 19th century view of antiquity. As Patrick Carnegie says, Wagner's constant aim through the 1840s and beyond was that what the spectator saw should correspond as closely as possible to what he heard in the music. Thus, in emulating the ancient Greek stage within a 19th century German theatre, accompanied by a Mendelssohnian soundscape, for Wagner then, Mendelssohn, Tieck and Buch had attempted to assimilate ancient and modern culture, essentially misdiagnosing the needs of German art by assuming that modern audiences could resonate with these appropriated ancient traditions. Also, in having only one set, the physical space could not reflect the dramatic action nor emotional transformation of the characters. This was a far cry from the inventive use of illusion Wagner would later come to use, as seen here by the mechanics behind the dragon in Siegfried and the swan car, as it's called here in Lohengrin. In offering very little spectacle that Wagner admired so much in the Paris opera, Antigone was not only a reminder to Wagner of the limitations of German theatres to bring about effective and large-scale spectacle, but was an exercise in historical exactitude. For Wagner, Antigone used scenery not for dramatic purposes, but merely decorative, and thus failed to reflect the very fabric of the drama as it unfolds. While Wagner admired how Sophocles foregrounds the dichotomy between state versus individual in Antigone, which is something I'll be touching on later, transforming the play into an overtly intellectual endeavour thus betrayed the contingency of its artistic historical origins and made it a form of lowbrow art or entertainment for the upper classes. It appealed to the immediacy of optics rather than any intrinsic appreciation for its political subject matter, which intensely attracted Wagner. Following the Wagnerian logic that the stage design is a physical representation of the musical and poetic drama, Antigone then was an academic, static portrayal of ancient theatrical culture. This brings me to my second theme, dramatic declamation. If you can cast your minds back to the extract I read at the start of my talk, I described a scene where we were in the house of Johann von Walkenstein, where he was hosting a dramatic reading of Antigone with Mendelssohn and Louise Brockhaus. This wasn't the only dramatic reading that took place. Edward de Vriend, who played Haman at the Court and Leipzig premiere, describes readings given by Tieck on the 9th and 14th of September in 1841. De Vriend even intimates that it was these very readings that induced King Friedrich to commission the production in the first place. It's well known that Wagner hosted similar dramatic readings and valued Leseprobe, or reading rehearsals, which encouraged his singers to get to grips with the text before the music. But rather than to rehearse the metrical patterns or the stage blocking, Wagner's readings mostly aimed to divorce themselves from the French school he found cold and static, as he wanted to find a more organic, natural style of dramatic declamation, that was visually appealing, acoustically effective, but ultimately emotionally provocative. Essentially, Wagner wanted his actors and actresses to become their character, not merely act as them. We see this in his 1853 essay, Remarks on Performing the Flying Dutchman, when he describes the first appearance of the enigmatic spectre. Quote, with the first crotchet of the third bar, he, the Flying Dutchman, makes his second step, always with folded arms and a sunken head. His third and fourth steps coincide with the notes of the 8th and 10th bars. The first phrases are to be sung without a trace of passion, almost in strict beat, like the whole of this recitative, as though the man were tired out. At the words declaimed with bitter ire, Zulzer Ozean, he does not break as yet into positive passion. More in terrible scorn, he merely turns his head half round towards the sea. During the ritornello, after Doch ewig meine Qual, he bows his head once more as though in utter weariness. The words Euch des fed mir float in, he sings in this posture, staring blankly before him. Even if it's not to the same length as Wagner, this integration of movement, gesture, and vocalization to bring about a full embodiment of a character is somewhat reminiscent in Mendelssohn's vision for Antigone's declamations. As he writes to George McFarren, when the curtain rises and Antigone has appeared, it must be the last bar but one of the overture, so that immediately after the last chord of the wind instruments, Antigone begins to speak while the chord is still kept. Again, the first chorus must begin as soon as Antigone has gone down the steps, and Creon must be seen immediately when the C major chord, fortissimo, comes down before the recitative of the choruses, and Creon must again begin to speak while the chord E flat is hardly given. Given this similarity of approach to synchronize physicality via the voice and the body with the music, why did Wagner not take to Antigone's style of declamation? I'm going to play the Commos from Mendelssohn's Fourth Choral Ode, so you get an idea of the various types of vocal delivery on display. And I do apologise for the layout of this slide. It was the only way I could get all of the 3 pages of the score on one. Please do let me know if there are any audio issues. It's about a 50-second extract, and just pay attention to the different types of utterance Antigone is speaking in here.
Oh, seht mich, seht Bürger der Väter Heimat, wie ich den letzten Weg dahin wandle, den letzten Strahl sehen soll von Helios Glanz und nie wieder. Lebend entführt Hades, all aufnehmend den Ruf, mich zu den Ufern Acherons. Hymenäen erschollen nicht, kein bräutliches Lied feierte mich mit Festklängen. Acheron ruft ins Brautbett mich.
I'd also really recommend the rest of the piece. I think it's brilliant, and it's a very, very underrated work by Mendelssohn. I think it was last performed publicly in the 2001 proms. I could be wrong about that, but do go check it out. There's an album on Spotify with it all there. So yeah, go enjoy. So in marrying spoken dialogue, accompanied speech in free rhythm, and melodrama in strict rhythm, Mendelssohn was tapping into contemporary discussions on the status of melodramatic speech in modern music as straddling sung and spoken utterance. Prominent figures such as August Schlegel and Hugo Riemann condemn it as a miscarriage of romanticism and an aesthetically reprehensible hybrid genre. As well as deploying melodrama, Mendelssohn, with the help of Buch, attempted to imitate the Greek prosody baked into Donner's German translation. To summarize a very, very complex linguistic issue that Jason Geary enumerates in great detail, and I've listed his work in my bibliography if anybody's interested, this was essentially done by mirroring the unstressed and stressed pitched syllables of ancient Greek with long and short note values. You can see the anapiece metrical footing consisting of short, long syllables in the recitative passage, here transcribed as quaver, crotchet, which he writes should be spoken with the notes. So this anapiece of short, long is in the purple circle, and then I've tried to highlight where the edition says to be spoken with the notes in the red there. Of course, we can debate to what extent this approach was accurate or even musically pleasing, but for our purposes today, it's important to note that attention was given to provide accurate renditions and metrical verse as closely as possible. Of course, Wagner dabbled with melodramatic and metrical settings. He tells us in his autobiographical sketch that his earliest feat was a metrical translation to one of Romeo's soliloquies during his youth, but unfortunately this manuscript has been lost. The second is his 1831 melodramatic setting to 7 scenes from Goethe's Faust, one passage of which shares a striking resemblance to Antigone. As we can see, both composers use the same musical signifier, so repeated falling chromatic and stepwise suspensions and appoggiaturas, to depict mania, lamentation, and distress in the female characters of Gretchen and Antigone, though they even use the same word of Wehe. You can hopefully see this motif in the blue boxes on my slide. Though it's a very early example, this typifies what David Trippett refers to when he discusses how melodrama played more of a role in Wagner's music than he would have us believe. Though Wagner's thematic borrowings of Eddic poetry have been enumerated by many scholars, his experimentation with Eddic rhyme and meter may not get as much recognition. He used rhyme in his libretti. Take this example of alternate rhyme and couplets in Lohengrin. So hopefully this is clear enough, but we have the first 4 lines consisting of alternate rhyme and then the latter 4 of rhyming couplets. So we have dich, sprich, seist, erweist, Kraft, laft, and rist und ist. He also uses the old Saxon principle of versification called Stabreim, or alliterative verse, in the Ring. The whole cycle even begins with this type of utterance. In Das Rheingord, the Rhine maidens repeat nonsensical words beginning with W, which eventually transmogrify into coherent speech. And here is a fantastic picture of the first Rhine maidens taken at Bayreuth in 1876. And to be honest, I just wanted an excuse to show this picture. Though it's evident that Eddic verse plays a role in articulating the soundscape of Wagner's music, particularly through rhyme and alliteration, what's important is he took poetic license to ensure he captured true speech inflections, as he writes in one of his essays. Indeed, he believed there was a fine line between the naturalness of vocal utterance and it being artificial. As David Trippett states, melodrama for Wagner was at the point at which verbal speech and music are caged into irreconcilably parallel modes of utterance. Wagner sought to bridge this gap in his later concept of vers mélodie, which enabled greater integration of poetry and music, and was even influenced by the tonality of ancient Greek, which none other than August Bach had introduced into. Though, of course, he still used free rather than strict rhythmic patterns. And I hope you can see how the quaver-crotchet rhythm Antigone was speaking to in that passage there definitely is opposed to that, is not what Wagner's referring to here. Though it would always be contested to what extent Mendelssohn abided to Greek meter, since he was handling it through a German translation, like Wagner, Mendelssohn had also taken artistic license to prioritize the musicality of his choruses, informed by their sentiment. But Wagner seems to overlook this. Perhaps he used this as an opportunity to lambast Mendelssohn's musical style, his discriminatory undertone perhaps not evading notice, believing that his pre-assembled prosodic use of the text did not render the unfolding of the drama to feel spontaneous or expressive. Perhaps he'd even been reminded by his earlier translations of the first 12 books of the Odyssey he'd completed as a 13-year-old schoolboy. If the expression and gesture were to be derived from the music and the text, as Wagner desired, then the spectrum of human emotion would now be tied to the undulations and the timing of meter with little wiggle room. This was, of course, antithetical to Wagnerian theories of declamation, since now the true poetic meaning of Antigone, which Wagner venerated, was now to be dictated and thus obscured by faux antiquarian prosody. While some may say that Antigone represented all the things Wagner wanted to reform about the modern German theatre in the middle of the century, the style of declamation, the technical capabilities of stage mechanisms, as well as the preoccupation with historical moment rather than myth, It's telling that he continues to speak about the production later in his life. Perhaps the most poignant example of this is to Nietzsche, to whom he writes a letter from Bayreuth on the 12th of June, 1872. He writes that, quote, "If I now envied Mendelssohn for the sake of his Finnish philology, I can only wonder that his philology did not prevent him from writing his music to Sophoclean dramas, since, despite my incompleteness, I had more respect for the spirit of antiquity than he seemed to betray. I also got to know other musicians who had remained Finnish Greeks, yet had nothing to do with their conducting, composing, and making music, while I, strangely enough, worked out an ideal for my artistic view of music from antiquity, which was so difficult for me to access. Be that as it may, I had a dull feeling that the spirit of antiquity was ultimately no more within the sphere of our Greek language teachers." Unquote. Wagner evidently valued Mendelssohn's classical education, particularly his proficiency in Latin and Greek. This he calls his philology. Franz Liszt even claimed in a letter to his partner Marie Dagout that Mendelssohn could read Homer in the original Greek. Wagner also remains open about his struggle to access this ideal of antiquity, almost as if it's better to draw inspiration from it in a mediated matter, as a distant utopian culture, rather than try and excavate any archaeological or linguistic fidelity, as Antigone unapologetically did. Indeed, in his 1878 essay, Public and Popularity, which is one of Wagner's last words on Antigone, suggests that all who acquire a Faustian thirst for knowledge would favour Antigone since, quote, "it offers archaeologic prospects of launching some historical thesis." It could also be argued that Wagner saw potential in Antigone. In providing his own dramatic analysis of the play, as well as committing several pages of opera and drama to his reading of the story of Oedipus, it's evident that the Theban plays meant a lot to him. Indeed, in another passage from the same essay, he praises it being chosen at Potsdam, almost as if, had more poetic and musical depth been given to its revival, he may have been in favour of it. He writes that, quote, "When the poet, in anxious yearning for the sight of a perfect art form, induced a ruler to command the performance of an old Greek tragedy, this tragedy should have been none other than our Antigone. One sought for the work in which this art form was shown the purest, and lo, it was precisely the work whose content was the purest essence of humanity, the destruction of the state. How rejoiced were the learned old children at this Antigone in the court theatre of Potsdam." His political ideologies hardly fail to suffuse his writing here, Antigone defying Creon's orders becoming his object of praise rather than Mendelssohn and his colleagues. I think that readers could also find this passage to be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, seemingly commending the choice of literary inspiration, but really stating how it would only appeal to those of a certain philological persuasion. This can be seen by his reference to the Greek language teachers and learned old children of Berlin. By somewhat mocking its spectatorship, we can assume that he saw Antigone as being an academic exercise, rather than harnessing the political crux of the play, which constituted the purest essence of humanity, as he writes here. In exercising the classicist muscle of 1840s Berlin, and thus for Wagner failing to ascertain the type of drama the community needed, it was conducive to a mere form of entertainment, being rich in lavish decoration and thus lacking in affective, poetic impetus. So, what are my conclusions? Firstly, that quirk histories matter. It's easy to confine the handful of performances Wagner attended to a tiny chapter of his life, having little resonance on his wider philosophy and being little more than a production he didn't like. However, when we look at the timeline of when Wagner specifically mentions Antigone in his writings, as well as cross-examine other critics who mention Wagner and Mendelssohn's Antigone in the same piece of writing, the overlap is quite astounding. While this certainly isn't an exhaustive list, it hopefully gives you an idea of the scope we're dealing with, since Wagner's reception of Antigone remained a hot topic until after his death. For example, in his 1893 biography of Wagner, so 10 years after the composer's death, American critic Henry Fink reiterates Wagner's anecdote about Spontini attending the Dresden performance. This shows us that somewhere around the turn of the century, where we also see a decline in critical commentary on Antigone, the production fell out of Wagnerian historiography, being confined to what we might call quirk histories. From this list, I'd also like to point out Glasenapp's work, which is here listed in the bottom right, and as he was the biographer that Wagner himself appointed. I may have given the impression that Antigone wasn't well received, though in truth it was more of a mixed bag. Many critics in England, North America, and even within Germany valued Mendelssohn's music for bringing the story of Antigone to life and believed it harnessed true artistic prowess and spoke to a new phase in modern German musical culture. Essentially, Mendelssohn was believed to have invented a new musical genre, though today we would simply call it incidental music. But as we can infer from our list here, it seems as if Mendelssohn's revival of Greek tragedy was situated discursively within the nexus of Wagnerian drama too. While Mendelssohn's and Wagner's approaches differed in terms of their musical style, their aesthetics, and even their politics, the imbrication of their shared aim to renew modern artistic life using ideas and practices from ancient culture become clear. In crying out, quote, "O holy Antigone, on thee I cry, let wave thy banner that beneath it we destroy and yet redeem." Wagner was using Antigone to sum up his political outlook, lamenting at Mendelssohn's incidental music failing to speak to real political issues, as Michael Steinberg suggests. In this sense, the rubric of Antigone becomes more than a sole production or even a play. It symbolizes Wagner's most fundamental musico-political axioms. My third conclusion is that to understand why Wagner turned to Germanic myth over Greek, we need to recognize that it was very much a theatrical issue rather than merely aesthetic or political. Ultimately, Wagner's experience of tragedy in the theatre, not merely through translation, was more formative than we think. It's important to note that Antigone employed some of the most prominent stage practitioners at the time. Indeed, many of Wagner's own acquaintances or people he knew and read were part of the production and its wider reception. So from Edward Devrient, Ludwig Tieck, August Buch, Gottfried Semper, Johann Droysen, Mendelssohn, as well as his own sister. Even August Kreilinger, who played Antigone at the Berlin premiere, coached Johanna Wagner in her role as Goethe's Iphigenia in 1861. Thus, we can state that Antigone and the surrounding discourses it provoked saturated musical and theatrical circles more than we think. So why has Antigone been overlooked in scholarship on Mendelssohn and on Wagner? Well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure. The sources speak for themselves, and it's quite striking that they've gone unnoticed for this long. Perhaps we've fallen into a bad habit of rehashing cliches, such as comparing the tetralogy of The Ring to the performances at the Dionysian Theatre, as well as Bayreuth's architecture to a Greek amphitheatre. From the perspective of Mendelssohn scholars, I also think that Wagnerian experimentations with the limits of theatrical experience eventually eclipsed more philologically oriented approaches to tragedy. It should also be remembered that Mendelssohn's reception in England was mostly characterized by his engagement with English literature and the Old Testament through A Midsummer Night's Dream, Paulus and Elijah, typifying his image as an educated and distinctly Protestant Victorian gentleman. The performances of Antigone at universities such as Oxford and Cambridge in the late 19th and early 20th century also ushered in a second wave of engagement with the work in academic traditions like the Cambridge Greek play. So while we can still use the concepts of revival and rebirth to frame Wagner's relationship with tragedy, it should also be understood as a reaction to broader attitudes towards the tragic in 19th century Germany, which itself was a remnant of 18th century Winckelmannian Hellenism. Ultimately, Mendelssohn's experimentation with the role music could play in articulating the tragic condition renders Antigone an ideal prism to explore shifting notions about how ancient performance culture could be synthesized with modern theatrical practice, a contention which sat at the heart of Wagnerian drama and continues to enlighten the performance and study of his works today. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. I'm sorry for going a bit over.
I'm laughing because you say that you are not a Wagner scholar, but
Oh,
it's very deep and complex.
yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. I
so
guess
thank
that's what I
you.
love. Sorry.
No, go on. Sorry, please
Yeah,
go
I
on.
guess that's what I love about Wagner. You know, it's almost like, where do you start? You know, when I was
Yes.
first kind of getting interested in his music and his aesthetics, I,
Mhm.
to be honest, was a bit overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And I guess I had a bit of an unorthodox introduction to Wagner, because it wasn't really his music that I was first kind of exposed to. It was more his ideas about music.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, and so I kind of came to the music after that. But yeah, that's what I love about him. It's how you can read it so many different ways. And I guess about opera, you know, you can always the way it's appropriated, the way it reflects particular political movements or kind of social tensions. Yeah, that's what I love about it. But yeah, it certainly makes it difficult from a practical perspective to actually research.
Yeah. In an unrelated question, okay, because it's a very complicated and deep topic. But my question is very simple, okay, maybe even unrelated. But why you decide to, why you choose this topic, okay? Yes, please
Of
explain.
Antigone, yeah.
Yes, Antigone. Yes.
Yeah. So as I think I mentioned at the start, this was very much an offshoot. This presentation was an offshoot from my MPhil thesis. And when I was researching for that, it appeared to me that Antigone was really one of the most talked about musical theatrical productions of its age, really. And part of my research was asking why no one talks about it today. You know, Mendelssohn's known for Elijah, Paulus, you know, all his oratorios, his symphonies, the Hebrides Overture, of course, but not Antigone, and even not his music for the Oedipus plays, which he did write. So there's this whole reception history that I wanted to uncover. And, you know, as I was writing my thesis, I was coming across these allusions to Wagner and how a lot of critics, particularly in England, seem to situate what Mendelssohn was doing in terms of bringing the ancient and the modern together. They were comparing that to what Wagner was doing.
Okay.
So I kind of saw that as a way into Wagner, like kind of through Mendelssohn. And yeah, it kind of provoked questions of where German music is going in the mid-19th century, kind of post Beethoven, but also pre the kind of apex of Wagner as well. It was kind of in this, you know, we had Schubert, Brahms, Schumann, of course, but also Mendelssohn, and people were asking, you know, who's essentially the next Beethoven, and what are we going to do with opera? What are we going to do with dramatic kind of musical drama? And I guess, yeah. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I won't go on too much. Yeah.
You think you want to develop further your research or not? There is
on this topic.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I know I covered quite a lot of sources in this presentation, but I think there's still more. There's a lot in archives that I just wasn't able to access, and I actually didn't even show you all of Wagner's references to Antigone. I mean, his whole essay on Sophocles and the kind of Theban plays. So by Theban plays, I mean Oedipus at Kolonos, Oedipus Rex, and Antigone. They were kind of a set of three. He gives a whole, you know, spiel about his own reading of this play, and I haven't really engaged with that in this presentation. So that's something that I'd really want to explore as well. But also how, I guess, thinking about historically informed performance today, I don't know whether that's not something that's really brought up in Wagner scholarship much. But I'm really intrigued by various kind of dramaturgical devices Wagner uses that are very kind of Greek. They're from Greek tragedy. So, for example, the idea of being kind of misidentified in a plot or wearing a disguise. That's the whole idea of where the mask comes from in Greek tragedy. The idea of female sacrifice that we see, pretty much everywhere in Wagner, but also in the plot of Antigone as well. So maybe drawing some more parallels between tragedy and Wagner through plot rather than just staging, as I really did here. But yeah, I think there's many avenues I could go down it with. And of course, Antigone wasn't the only incidental play. There were very many. I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen.
No.
Okay, that's fine. No, that's fine. I just, if anyone's interested, I mean, my thesis explained this in detail, but Antigone wasn't the only one. There was a kind of a run of Greek tragic plays that were happening in Berlin at this time. Antigone was just the first one. So whether Wagner actually refers to any of those, I'm not sure. I think he does refer to Mendelssohn's Oedipus at one point. But yeah, so there's a whole kind of lineage of incidental music that's being forgotten about here. And I'm really trying to bring it to light. I mean, I said that I really identify as a Wagner scholar early in my presentation. What I would rather say I am is someone who looks at reception history and kind of dramatic music. So I think that encompasses, yes, opera, yes, Wagner, yes, Rossini, Puccini, but also incidental plays. And you kind of get the, I guess, not the highbrow and the lowbrow, but you're getting all these different styles that we can class as dramatic music. And I would class myself as a scholar who looks at dramatic music. But yeah, anyway, I'm going on too much, but I think it has a lot of potential. Yeah.
Because I would like to invite you. I will tell you publicly now. I would like to invite you for other talks, online talks about this topic, because it's very interesting. This the connection between the link between the ancient Greek theater and Wagner, music.
Thank you.
Because it's very complicated, very deep, but I would like to have you again.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great.
If you're available. Well, I don't know if there are any questions. If not, Holly, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, member and part. Thank you for your beautiful article and for this presentation. You are a member now of the Richard Wagner Society of Avellino, so welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined.
Yes, thank you.
For today's talk. So we invite you to follow our social media channel of the La Voce Wagneriana, the Richard Wagner Association of Avellino. And thank you again, Holly.
Thanks.
So see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.